Good evening. I'm Stewart Brand from the Long Now Foundation. Stories are something we use, something we tell a lot of the time to understand the world. We've been doing this for a long time. We'll probably keep doing it for a long time. You saw on the screen Danny Hillis's narrative version of thinking about a 10,000-year clock. And we're actually building a 10,000-year clock physically in Texas. Our speaker tonight is a prolific writer. This is Sandman Volume 1. And he's also a prolific reader. Grew up basically in libraries, he says. And libraries are these time-spanning places where stories and other such things collect. And as a writer, he's unusually transparent about being a writer, about the writing, about stories. And we could think of no one better to talk about the long now question: how exactly do stories last? Neil Gaiman.
Many, many years ago, I remember defining art as something that you could use successfully to stun a burglar. And was very proud of myself for having written enough Sandman to do that. Watching Stewart drop it on the stage. I did actually try and persuade DC Comics to do the one-volume Sandman, and failed because apparently bookbinding is not up to the task. And also it might kill the poor burglar. So thank you, Stewart. Thank you to the Long Now Foundation. Thank you to everybody who's invited me to come and talk, particularly Danny Hillis, who is not here. But thank you, Danny. I want to talk about stories. The first emperor of China died 2,300 years ago. He did a lot of very important things in China, things they still talk about. For example, he regularized the distance between the wheels of carts. Now, this may not seem an incredibly important thing to you, how far apart your cart wheels are. But when you realize that all carts and carriages essentially traveled in the ruts in roads, in muddy roads that at some point would be mud and then they would dry out, and you're traveling in ruts, standardizing the distance of your wheels meant that you could travel from one end of China to the other. A wheeled conveyance could go from one end of that vast empire to the other end. He did a lot of other things too. Was absolutely the most powerful man in the world, and like many such powerful men, he became obsessed with immortality, with not dying, ever, under any circumstances. His unfortunate failure to achieve success in this via the usual magical and alchemical routes, resulted in his death. They actually tried covering up his death for a while. They sent his body home in a carriage filled with rotting fish to mask the smell and claim that the smell was the fish. And he was rapidly interred in a tomb that he had been building for quite a bit of his life. The location of the tomb was soon lost. And pretty soon there were only stories about his tomb. Stories that said the tomb contained unimaginable treasures, including a terracotta army of soldiers and ships that floated on seas of underground mercury. They built whole lakes of mercury and put ships on them. There was another king whose name we do not know. His likeness was carved in marble and placed on a marble plinth to last forever. And the reason why we do not know his name is his name was carved into the marble on the base of the plinth. But after a few hundred years, the marble peeled away and was lost, leaving the granite on the plinth with the name of the sculptor carved into it. So we know who did it. The oldest forms of life around right now, if we are to believe Wikipedia, are probably trees. And the oldest tree that we know of, a Great Basin bristlecone pine in Northern California, is 5,064 years old, which is quite old when you stop to think about it. 5,064 years. Life, again, according to Wikipedia, you can see where I did my research on this, is the condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, we are told, which definitely disqualifies stories. But then we discover that it includes the capacity for growth, reproduction, functional activity, and continual change preceding death. So, animals live at the outside 300 years, really long-lived ones. Trees, really long-lived ones again, 4,000 to 5,000 years. Stories can live longer than that. And we know, because we have stories that go back longer than that. There are Native American stories from the Pacific Northwest that tell of forbidden love between a woman of astonishing beauty and a young man, and of how their love was punished, of how the earth rumbled, of the black snow that came out from the mountaintop, and then how the top of the mountain became fire, killing a great many people, only to be stopped when the young woman was pushed in to the flames. And it's a story that survives and was collected first in the 1920s. And it survived because it contains elements that people love to tell and to retell. Forbidden love, tragic death. But the story itself tells us a lot of other things. It tells us, most importantly, that those mountains that you're looking at, those great big mountains that seem like they must have been there forever, are not permanent things. It tells us that volcanoes can happen. It tells you of the early warning systems, the idea that the ground can shake, that ash will fall. And if you are passing on a story, generation to generation, and you want that information to travel, you really have probably about 3 generations of passing it on as pure information. You can say to your children and to your grandchildren, you know those mountains over there that look kind of solid? Well, they aren't. And ash can fall, the ground can shake, and they will turn to flame, and this hot, flaming, rocky stuff will come out of them. And your grandson may believe this. But his grandson, when he says, you know, my grandfather told me, is going to go, yeah, really? It's a mountain. And his grandson is going to go, you people are mad. No, I'm not passing on that story. But if the story has things that make it sweet around it, things that make it fun to pass on, things that make it pleasurable to tell, in this case, beautiful women, forbidden love, grumpy gods, somebody being sacrificed into a volcano. People getting thrown into volcanoes, it always works. It is, you know, and the giant list of things that we authors have, tricks that never fail. Right after somebody comes through the door with a gun is throw somebody into a volcano. The Tale of Two Brothers is a story, dates back about 2000 BC to Seti, the second Seti. It was recorded on papyrus by a scribe about 4,000 years ago. The story centers around two brothers, Anpu, the elder, who is married, looks after the younger, Bata. The brothers work together, farming land, raising cattle. One day, Anpu's wife attempts to seduce Bata, but he rejects her advances. She then tells her husband that his brother tried to seduce her, and Anpu obviously very sensibly tries to kill his brother, who flees, prays to be saved. The god save him by creating a crocodile-infested lake between him and his brother, across which Bata explains his side of the story, and to emphasize his sincerity, cuts off his genitalia, throws them into the water, and they are eaten by a catfish. It's only just begun. Bata then says that he is going to go to the Valley of the Cedar, where he will place his heart on the top of the blossom of a cedar tree. So if it's cut down, Anpu will be able to find it and allow Bata to become alive again. And he gives Anpu he tells him that if ever his beer mysteriously froths, he knows to come and hunt down his brother. And then Anpu goes home, kills his wife, there is a theme in these things, and it's not particularly cheerful. Meanwhile, Bata has a new life for himself, and he has a new wife created for him by the gods, and because she is divine, Pharaoh falls in love with her, and she tells the Pharaoh to go and cut down the tree on which Bata has his heart, and Bata dies, and then the beer gets frothy, and Anpu goes off, and there's all sorts of fun. Bata keeps getting resurrected. First as a bull, and they murder the bull, and then 2 drops of blood get rescued from the bull, and they become trees. And Bata, in the form of a tree, now appeals to his wife. But she goes back to the Pharaoh, and she says, look, let's make furniture out of those trees. But as they are making furniture, a splinter enters her mouth, impregnating her. And thus her son is her resurrected husband and becomes crown prince and appoints his brother as his co-ruler, and it's all fun and games in ancient Egypt. And the reason I've told you that story at such length is it's a 4,000-year-old story. That's a long time when you think about 4,000 years. And a couple of years ago, I was chatting to an Egyptologist, and she was telling me about how they were on an archaeological dig with the locals in Egypt helping them as the support team. And they started telling stories around the campfire. And the oldest man told them that he would tell them a story that he heard from his father. And he began to tell them the tale of 2 brothers named Anpu and Bata. And she realized she was hearing the oral version of something that was written down 4,000 years ago that had been told as a story. For 4,000 years, that's right up there with the trees. A story is alive. Can they be considered alive? What was our list? Growth, reproduction, functional activity, and continual change. Do stories grow? Pretty obviously. Anybody who has ever heard a joke being passed on from one person to another knows that they can grow, they can change. Can stories reproduce? Well, yeah. Not spontaneously, obviously. They tend to need people as vectors. We are the media in which they reproduce. We are their petri dishes. But they can, and they do. Stories grow. Sometimes they shrink. They reproduce. They inspire other stories. And of course, if they do not change, stories die. It's fascinating going back and looking through old fairy tales, old oral tradition stories, and watching the ones that just do not get told anymore. There is nothing about them that impels people to say, let me tell you the story. Whereas stories sometimes will simply enter the oral tradition, and sometimes stories will find they will mutate, they will change just a little, and they will wind up with an evolutionary advantage over other similar stories. I've been told this isn't true, but damn, it's a good story, so I'm going to tell it to you anyway. In a story about stories, it seems only fair. The story of Cinderella. Cinderella probably began in China. There is definitely evidence that it may have begun in China. There are very few Western cultures in which having incredibly small feet was actually deemed a mark of obvious princesshood. There is a case to be made, he said rather nervously, because maybe there isn't. Somebody sent me, somebody heard me talking about this recently and sent me a thing completely disproving it. And I went, no, it's too beautiful. But one of the most significant things about Cinderella is the glass slippers. They're probably the most memorable bit of Cinderella. The idea of slippers made of glass. There is a theory that originally those slippers might have been fur, which in French is ver, V-A-I-R. And that through a homonymic shift, they became ver, V-E-R-R-E, and slipped from fur slippers, which sound fairly regular, to glass slippers, which are gloriously unlikely, and stick in the memory, and give the story of Cinderella a tiny evolutionary advantage over all the stories that are kind of like Cinderella, of which there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And yet Cinderella is the one that we remember. And people go, oh, well, that's Disney. And you go, no, actually, it's not. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me is that there are places where Disney would take an old story, a fairy tale, and try and retell it, and bump into some of the problems inherent in the actual story they were telling. For example, Sleeping Beauty. The best thing about Sleeping Beauty is she falls asleep for 100 years. And during that 100 years, thorns grow up around the castle. And eventually, after 100 years, a prince hacks his way in, snogs her, and everybody wakes up. Disney ran into obvious problems with that, which is it's really hard to start a story and then have a solid 100 years. If she meets a prince early on in the film, he will be dead. It's not going to be him. So they made it an afternoon. You go back and watch Sleeping Beauty. They fall asleep. Thorns grow up. Prince gallops in, kisses her. Everybody wakes up. They barely had a nap. But that hasn't lasted. That's not the way people will tell the story. Although, of course, Sleeping Beauty, as originally told in a lot of the versions we have, was actually just a prelude. It was where a story began. Sleeping Beauty was the intro to the real story, which is she goes home with the prince, and his mother is appalling and does all the things that appalling mother-in-laws do, viz and to wit, try and frame her daughter for having killed and eaten her children. And that was the exciting bit. That was where the story went. But that bit kind of faded. It died. The story itself mutated, and people seemed perfectly happy to have the happily ever after happen there, happen after the waking up. Stories have creators. Every story begins at some point with an act of imagining. Scientists, who are not in other ways fanciful, get very inventive when it comes to the origins of stories. I've read otherwise sensible papers, articles, and books which assume suddenly the existence of a communal undermind. Yours, mine, everybody in histories, and stories sitting deep in there, already fully formed, like jewels in a deep mine. The idea of an individual storyteller is actually discouraged, as is the idea that somebody plotted a story. Stories can only be seen in this context as being passed on from one person to another, with details accreting or being lost on the way as they change. And some people who wrote about stories went to even stranger places. Perec states with certainty that in any story, any early old story, in any folk tale in which a character falls asleep, we know that this story was originally a dream. And because primitive humans were unable to tell the difference between waking and sleeping, they would have woken up with the story in their heads, produced on some magical unconscious level. I remember reading that story and being absolutely fascinated by it. Have you ever tried to tell someone, even a friendly, sympathetic, even someone who loves you, a dream of yours the next morning? Have you ever watched their eyes glaze over? Watch them slowly lose the ability to feign interest, probably along with the will to live. Even as you start to suspect that threads of narrative causality that seemed obvious on waking don't exist. You're saying, well, then we were back in my old school, which was a kind of castle. And in the toilets, there was a tree. So we climbed it, and you realize that no matter how gripping it was for you while it was going on, it is not going to be gripping by lunchtime. Pictures, I think, may have been a way of transmitting stories. The drawings on cave walls that we assume are acts of worship or of sympathetic magic, intended to bring hunters luck and good kills. I keep wondering if actually they're just ways of telling stories. We came over that ridge and we saw a herd of woolly bisons. And I wonder that because people tell stories. It's an enormous part of what makes us human. We will do an awful lot for stories. We will endure a lot for stories. And stories in their turn, like some kind of symbiote, help us endure and make sense of our lives. A lot of stories do appear to begin as intrinsic to religions and belief systems. A lot of the ones we have gods or goddesses in them. They teach us how the world exists. They teach us the rules of living in the world. But they also have to come in an attractive enough package that we take pleasure from them and we want to help them propagate. Human beings are hardwired to appreciate simile and metaphor. For those of you who are incredibly relieved to no longer be at school, and who are pretty sure you know the difference between the two, it's the as. The simile is as beautiful as an airport. That was Douglas Adams' example of a simile that nobody has ever used. He said, nobody ever says as beautiful. It was as beautiful as an airport. And a metaphor is when you say that something is something else to help you understand it better. The moon is a ghostly galleon tossed upon stormy seas. And it isn't. It is not what the moon is. It's a big lump of rock in the sky. It's not a ghostly galleon. But it is our capacity to use simile and use metaphor that I think allows us to understand and appreciate the best things about stories. Because people can have two contradictory things going on in their heads at the same time. And those contradictory things are these. A story is a lie, and a story is true. Stories, let us make no bones about it, are lies. They didn't really happen. Once upon a time is a code for I am about to lie to you. For that matter, this really happened to a friend of someone I know is also code for I'm lying to you. But I believe there is a possibility that this might actually have happened to somebody somewhere, somehow. The act of reading a story or listening to a story is the act of knowing you are being lied to. But it's a true thing. You have walked with the people in the story. You've looked out through their eyes. You know what they believe. You walked with them, and by walking with them, you have left your own reality and entered theirs. And that gives us something very strange, because information in a story is something that you can access as real information. You can access it as if you have experienced it. You can use it. And then you can pass it on. There's meant to be a break and a huge difference between the oral tradition of storytelling and the written tradition of storytelling, I'm not as convinced. People tell each other stories. There's a lovely example from the 1920s of folklorists collecting a story that had been told, that had been written in the 1890s by a lady named Lucy Clifford. And she'd written a story called The New Mother, and it was collected under the name of the Pear Drum. And what was great is they'd left out all of the bad writing, all of the weirdness of the prose. They just got down to the story. But they kept the oddest bits of the story. The fact that it had happened, this weird story had happened to two children named Turkey and Blue Eyes. That got remembered. That stayed in the oral tradition. There's a story I like to tell because it changed me. And stories should change you. Good stories should change you. And this story, this isn't mine. This is a story of something that happened to my cousin Helen. She's 97. And she was in Poland during the war and was in the ghetto for some of the war. She was a Holocaust survivor, a remarkable woman. And a few years ago, she started telling me this story of how in the ghetto they were not allowed books. If you had a book, somebody could, well, not just somebody, the Nazis could put a gun to your head and pull the trigger. Books were forbidden. And she used to teach under the pretense of having a sewing class, of doing sewing. She would actually teach a class of about 20 little girls. And they would come in for an hour a day. And she would teach them maths. She'd teach them Polish. She'd teach them grammar. And one day somebody slipped her a Polish translation of Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind. And Helen stayed up. She blacked out her window so she could stay up an extra hour, and she read a chapter of Gone with the Wind. And when the girls came in the next day, instead of teaching them, she told them what happened in the book. And each night, she'd stay up. And each day, she'd tell them the story. And I said, why? Why would you risk death for a story? And she said, because for an hour every day, those girls weren't in the ghetto. They were in the American South. They were having adventures. They got away. I think 4 out of those 20 girls survived the war. And she told me how, when she was an old woman, she found one of them who was also an old woman. And they got together and called each other by names from in Gone with the Wind, the names of characters. And I thought, we decry too easily, writers, what we do as being kind of trivial, the creation of stories as being a trivial thing. But the magic of escapist fiction, and the thing I think that some people miss, I think I missed, is that it can actually offer you a genuine escape from a bad place. And in the process of escaping, it can furnish you with armor, with knowledge, with weapons, with tools you can take back into your life to help make it better. I doubt there's anybody who loves reading who hasn't at some point gone to a book, sometimes when they're young, as a means of escaping from an otherwise intolerable situation. And you know what? It's a real escape. And when you come back better armed than when you left. Helen's story is a true story. And this is what we learn from it, that stories are worth risking your life for. They're worth dying for. Written stories and oral stories both offer escape. Escape from somewhere, escape to somewhere. I mentioned Douglas Adams before. Douglas understood media, understood change. He essentially described the first e-books long before most commuter trains were filled with people reading on them. And he also correctly perceived why, even though most commuter trains are 100% people with e-books, there will always be physical books and a healthy market for physical books. Because Douglas told me, books are sharks. I remember saying to him, I have no idea what that means. He said it incredibly confidently. He said, well, books are sharks. And it's like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he said, well, what you have to understand is that there were sharks back when there were dinosaurs. In many cases before there were dinosaurs, there were sharks. And now there are sharks. And the reason that there are still sharks hundreds of millions after the first sharks, of years after the first sharks turned up, is that nothing has turned up that is better at being a shark than a shark is. E-books are absolutely fantastic at being several books and a newspaper. They're really good portable bookshelves. That's why they're great on trains. But books are much better at being books. You can drop them. I can guarantee that copy of the first Sandman Omnibus still works. But stories aren't books. Books are simply one of the many storage mechanisms in which stories can be kept. And obviously, people are one of the other storage mechanisms. Stories change. The professions and the media that we use to store and record and transmit stories will change. Not long ago, the people who stored and transmitted information were stonemasons. Now, not so much. Unless we want the information to last. Paper or solar-powered digital headstones may be a thing, but a big lump of granite is pretty much forever. As individuals, we are cut off from humanity. As individuals, we are naked. We do not even know which plants will kill us. Without the mass of human knowledge accumulated over millennia to buoy us up, we are in big trouble. With it, we are warm, fed, we have popcorn, we are sitting in comfortable seats, and we are capable of arguing with each other about really stupid things on the internet. That's because we have stories. It's because we have information. In 1984, a man whose name I don't know how to pronounce, I think it's Thomas Sebok, wrote a report for the Department of Energy. He was asked to create a report because they had a problem of what to do with nuclear waste repositories. They needed to devise a method of warning future generations not to mine or drill at that site unless they're aware of the consequences of their actions. And because the stuff that they would be putting in these nuclear waste repositories had a half-life of 10,000 years, they needed to figure out ways to get information to last for 10,000 years. And they started by looking at, well, you can write things. The trouble with writing things is writing things lasts a certain amount of time. But anyone here who's actually tried to read Beowulf in the original knows that that only takes you so far. Language changes. Words change meaning. You know, you could write that something is wicked. You could warn that this is like the bomb. And a generation could somehow come along and go, wicked, the bomb. We got cool stuff in there. It could happen. Inconceivable, I know, but language changes. And if language is changing, well, what about pictographics? What if you put a big skull up? And Sebok pointed out, I'm going to call him Tom, because I know how that's pronounced. Tom pointed out that even a skull means different things in different cultures. Some cultures might go, skull, symbol of warning. Some might go, symbol of fantastic candy days. This is the place where the good stuff is. What he actually came up with, I'm going to read this because I love it. He said that the prime recommendation of the Human Interference Task Force of the Department of Energy was that information be launched and artificially passed on into the short-term and long-term future with the supplementary aid of folkloristic devices, in particular a combination of an artificially created and nurtured ritual and legend. The most positive aspect of such a procedure is it need not be geographically localized or tied to any one language and culture. So the uninitiated would be steered away from the hazardous site for reasons other than the scientific knowledge of the possibility of radiation and its implications. Essentially, the reason would be accumulated superstition to shun a certain area permanently. A ritual with the legend retold year by year with presumably slight variation. The actual, quote, truth would be entrusted exclusively to what we might call, for dramatic emphasis, an atomic priesthood. That is a commission of knowledgeable physicists, experts in radiation sickness, anthropologists, and whatever additional expertise may be called for in the future. Membership in this priesthood would be, they would pick themselves, and the best mechanism for doing this, he says, is at present unclear. Folklore specialists that they've consulted say they know of no precedent, nor could they think of a parallel situation, except the well-known but ineffectual curses associated with the burial sites of some Egyptian pharaohs, which didn't deter greedy grave robbers from digging for hidden treasure. Which is true, up to a point. The first emperor of China died over 2,000 years ago, and the site of his tomb was lost, very intentionally lost. You know, he killed anybody who knew where it was. It was a magnificent act of tomb losing. And then one day, in a field in China, somebody unearthed a terracotta warrior. And then they found another one. And they excavated the warriors, and archaeologists worked out very quickly where the actual mausoleum had to be. But the stories that had come down to us 2,300 years after the Emperor of China had died now became a warning. Remember those lakes of mercury? That stuff is really poisonous. It doesn't even have a half-life. It's just there. As Terry Pratchett once said, radiation is 10,000 years, but arsenic is forever. And so they didn't immediately start digging. Instead, they checked, confirmed the presence of incredibly high quantities of mercury, and have been figuring out what to do ever since. And when they figure out how to get in there without dying, they will start excavating. The long now, and the clock of the long now, is about planning for the long term and thinking in the long term. In a world in which people appear to be thinking in the shorter and shorter term, not even necessarily at this point about things that will take them to the end of their lifetime, which at least at one point you would have thought people would go, well, you know, I'll be dead before that's a problem. Looking around now at the mess that we're making of things on this planet, you want to go to people, you know, actually you won't be. You will still be around. We could run out of water, you'll be here, having to figure out what to do with no water. What to do when the oceans are screwed up. What to do when Twitter finally becomes sentient. Tom Sebeok concluded you couldn't actually create a story that would last 10,000 years. You could only create a story that would last for 3 generations, for ourselves, for our children, and for their children. But what we can do, I think, is try and create stories that are interesting enough and important enough that our grandchildren might want to tell those stories to their grandchildren. Because that's the purpose of stories. It's what they're for. They make life worth living, and sometimes they keep us alive. Thank you.
Whoa, sorry about that. You know, Danny Hillis, our friend, thinks that humanity is in a kind of transition now from one narrative to another. And there's some of the confusion we have is that the narrative that he thinks has been going on for a long time is man conquers nature. We basically take on all the difficulties of the natural world and one by one master them. And so we talk now about the Anthropocene. And if that's, and we see the downside of mastering nature and getting into some of the problems you mentioned. So he thinks we're working up on another narrative that doesn't have the problems that emerged from the last narrative, but is equally compelling and it gives the kind of meaning that you talk about. Do you have any sense of, one, what a transition from one grand narrative to another is about? And do you have any sense of what narrative wants to emerge?
What a great question. I think that for me, it's much more of the idea of going back. And I think it's partly about the narrative that we're in now feels like a narrative defined by the Alvin Toffler future shock idea, the idea that things are just changing so rapidly that we're scrambling to catch up. We're scrambling to stay in the present. If you stop paying attention, you will be swept back in time. It's wonderful right now talking to people about telephone use. I heard somebody say last night, use the phrase, of course, I'm of the generation where you could just telephone somebody, call them, make a voice call. You didn't have to text them to let them know you were going to be calling them.
Right.
And I thought, I'm of that generation. That's it. You know, my daughter Maddie, who I can embarrass just by acknowledging her existence from this stage. Hi, Mads. Is her telephone, her phone is something that the only people who ever actually phone her to talk on it is me and her mum. It is a device that is used for 1,000 things and that peculiarly parents use to call you. I love that. I love the idea that I am now some kind of weird fossil. I'm like my mum's friends who would write thank you letters. And you know, in the 1970s, I'm going, why? I was at your house yesterday. Why have you written a thank you letter? it seemed so peculiar. It seemed like a remnant of a Victorian time. It seemed like a remnant of something. The idea that you're getting swept up and moving forward, and that things are changing so fast, and that, you know, the lovely thing for me about coming to the Bay Area is there are people who will use phrases like the singularity and actually mean it. Like it's not even ironic. And
It goes in and out.
but you want to be able to. But for me, the Danny narrative is actually not a narrative of moving forward. It's just taking a step back, taking the long view, going, look, it actually doesn't matter what you do with your phone, and it doesn't matter that everybody here who is of the generation that knows you have to text before you would make a voice call, which why would you do that? That they, in their turn, are going to turn around in 8 years' time and say to people, but why do I have to send them a photograph of my genitals before I talk to them? And people are going, well, how can you trust anybody who hasn't sent you a photo of their genitalia? And you're going, but look, I'm just of a generation where you got to know somebody first before you were introduced to your genitalia, and they're going, well, you're old, you know, and it's going to be a whole kind of, you know that, sorry, Maddie. You know that things are going to keep changing, and that is the only constant, except that there are things that don't change, and there are people, and there is this planet, and we're on it. And we had better, you know, for me, the whole thing of the clock of the long now and of the long now is just try and think in big chunks. Because at the moment that you're trying to think in a 10,000-year chunk, you go, you know, if we use all that stuff up, there won't be any, which is kind of one of those moments of horrible realization. I remember writing a book years ago called Good Omens with Terry Pratchett. And we had a little rant in there about the idea of the afterlife, of telling people that, you know, it'll all get sorted out in heaven. And we're saying, actually, you know, it's very useful to point people at the fact that you are here right now on this planet, and if you kill whales, then you've got dead whales. If you kill all the whales, you don't have any whales. And nobody's going to come in and sort that out. So you had better look at consequences, and you had better try and look at things long term. And for a humorous book about the Antichrist, the end of the world, and why we're all going to die, we tried to say, you know, useful things in there.
You know, I realized I was a fossil when I read the other day that in Thailand they're having a problem with up-boob selfies. Up-boob selfies of, I guess, ladies taking photographs looking up that don't include their faces. So the Thai government is having a real problem finding who the criminals are that are doing this. Now that's a workaround. Chris does have a relevant question here. Do you think the internet, Facebook, Twitter, blogs, and so on, is helping or hurting literacy and the quality of writing and storytelling?
I think a lot more writing is happening.
Yes.
Due to the internet. And I think that bit is great. I just love the fact that more people are writing. I think the biggest problem that we have, and I think this just applies to that in the same way that it applies to everything else, is we have gone from a scarcity-based information economy to a glut information economy. In the old days, finding the thing that you needed was like finding the flower in the desert. You would have to go out into the desert, you would find the flower. And now it's like finding a flower in the jungle. Or worse, finding the flower in the flower gardens. So do I think it's helping? Do I think it's hurting? I think it's great that people are writing. I think a lot of people are writing who would not have to have written and did not expect themselves to be writing, but I also think that thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people are writing fiction, are writing things that they simply wouldn't have written because there wouldn't have been an audience, because there wasn't a way of getting it out.
So there's more storytelling and more story reading. It sounds
There's more
like.
storytelling, there's more story reading. The task becomes finding the good stuff for whatever your definition of good stuff is. And your definition of good stuff might be some horribly specialized form of Harry Potter slash. But it's finding the good stuff out there in the glut, in the jungle. And it fascinates. I was talking about Good Omens just now. Good Omens is about 105,000 words.
Writers always know exactly how many words have been written.
And there's probably out there in the world 5 million words of Good Omens fan fiction.
Really? Oh my God.
And you sort of go, well,
Talk about reproducing.
it's out there, exactly. It's the idea of stories getting out there and just reproducing. I love that. I think that's very strange and it's a wonderful thing. I don't necessarily know how things are going to work in the world of publishing, story finding, story reading 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. But at least I'm not pretending that I know. I think weird things are happening, and it's really interesting watching some systems break and watching other things make people very, very happy.
See, a riff kind of on your point about Twitter going sentient. You would be the first to know, I think, if that happens, because what do you have, 1.5 million?
2.1 million followers out there.
Good. And you know,
I suspect that some of them may not exist in real life.
and they're reading you instead of reproducing. Never mind. Nina Salvador asks, much of our media right now is concerned with the idea of the emergence of a strong AI, sentient Twitter. If you were to write this story, how would it go? The strong AI thing is the current dark singularity version story that's going around. And so, Hawking is scared to death of it. Elon Musk is scared to death of it.
How would I write it? How would it go? I don't know. I do know that I would write it personally. I would make it small and personal because that's how I write stories.
So you would be taking the reader inside the emerging consciousness of this AI's coming into...
much more likely, inside the consciousness of the person who owns the toaster in which the AI is manifesting.
It's a ghost story. Yeah. Yeah. Horror.
One of those things that was... When I was a kid, reading science fiction and loving science fiction, I thought you could classify science fiction into the people who were obviously writing about the future that you were traveling into. There was Asimov, there was Heinlein, there was Clarke, maybe Larry Niven. These guys they could do the techie stuff and it was all right. And then there was the ones who were just making it up and frankly weren't even trying. Like J.G. Ballard and Philip K. Dick. And now I look around and I go, Ballard got it right. Dick got it right. And, Heinlein and Asimov and Clarke, bless their little cotton socks. Got it so gloriously wrong. Pretty much completely. If you read Philip K. Dick now, and you watch, your toaster arguing with your fridge. And you're going, yeah, I know this world. This is the world we are heading for. You watch Ballard writing things like Memories of the Space Age, or Crash, a terrifyingly percipient piece of fiction about the death of Lady Di long before she had.
Oh my goodness. You got that.
That's really what, it's sort of like going, oh, this is, they were definitely, it was the ones who I thought were just making it up as they went along, who actually were getting the future kind of right. Then there's Bill Gibson, of course. And Bill, but I'm never sure with Bill how much of it was just him making up the future and us all going, yeah, that's cool, we'll go there.
James Welcher asks, he's worried about the dark side of stories that stay with us for a long time, such as many stories that blame women for original sin. Are there some stories worth forgetting?
I think that there is an incredible amount of misogyny in an awful lot of old stories, and I tend, partly because of that, to find myself sympathizing with those mythographers and such who go, well, it probably started out with women in charge and having the stories and having the magic before one day some guy went, well, they may be able to do this amazing baby-making magic, and they may be smarter than us, but we're big and we're hairy. So, ha-ha. We are now going to cast them down, and we're going to make up our own stories and religions, and in those, we're going to put them in their place. Which I like the idea that one of the things we're doing now is trying, or some of us are trying to redress that balance.
So gender is a recurring story theme. Animals are an astonishingly recurring story mode. Do you use animals? Do you tell
You ever
animal
hung
stories?
around a cat?
Huh?
I mean, yes, you have to.
And kids
I don't
buy
believe there's
animal stories.
there's an entire website of just authors with cats. And you can tell that they are giving us all our best ideas. I love writing animals. But I also think that one of the things about animals in fiction is they are your first attempt to put your head into the other, into experiencing another, the idea of another. One thing that I thought about talking about in that talk, and then I thought, I know I'm going to wander all over the place. Probably this is too far to wander, so I didn't. But fiction, I list a bunch of things that fiction does, and a bunch of things that stories do. I don't talk about probably the most important thing that I think fiction does, which is it lets us look out through other eyes. I said that, but it also gives us empathy. The act of looking out through other eyes tells us something huge and important, which is that other people exist. That we are not, it's very, very, you look at some narratives from some cultures and you go, there is absolutely no empathy here. There is no idea that what you are doing that anybody exists as anything other than a self-motivated thing. I think one of the things that fiction can give us is just the realization that no, behind every pair of eyes, there's somebody like us. And perhaps looking out through animal eyes, there's something like us. Looking out through alien eyes, there's somebody like us.
One of our speakers in this series was Steven Pinker, who did this book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, about the basically perpetual decline in cruelty, violence, and injustice. And he points to the rise of the novel in Europe as one of the sort of turning points where the circle of empathy was encouraged to get suddenly wider. Mm-hmm. Because you would get inside characters who you would never meet or talk to in real life, but you're inside their story. And so a book comes along like Uncle Tom's Cabin, and you're inside characters in a sympathetic frame that you now have to take their situation seriously in a way that you never did before, and it changed human behavior.
Absolutely.
Is that your view?
And people, and what's wonderful about that is these characters were lies. Mm-hmm. They didn't exist. Harriet Beecher Stowe had gone and made up people. But making up people, those made up people, when you've lived with them and you can care about them, you can suddenly extrapolate. You can make the head jump to real people.
You live with them means you're living with them through a tale, through a series of events, situations they have to deal with. And you now are with them trying to solve the problems that they're facing.
Exactly.
So you are walking a mile in their shoes. Christopher.
I was just to say also, I mean, you look at somebody like Dickens, the social novels of Dickens,
Okay.
where Dickens actually, for good or ill, wound up in a lot of his novels just taking social situations that he wanted to let people know about. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of cases, causing reform. Mm-hmm. Real, actual social reform happened. People changed their behavior, or institutions were abolished. Things were changed because people who had nothing to do with something or were content to let it go suddenly had their noses rubbed in the Victorian workhouse system, in the Court of Chancery, in the things that he had problems with, in some of the terrible schools. And reformers came from caring, they came from having traveled with fictional people to whom terrible things were happening and going, this thing which has happened to these people that I care about should be stopped. And it was stopped.
It seems like he attempted an even more amazing thing with something like The Christmas Story, Scrooge and so on. It has become a mythic level story, which is sort of told at Christmas time again and again. And the turns of that plot is a story that everybody now can refer to. Do you think, you've looked at Dickens pretty closely, do you think Dickens had in mind that he was going to do a mythic level story? And it had to be short, and it had to have a ghost. And it was going to be this amazing long nowish story of binding past, present, and future. And he was going to go deep and lasting. Do you think that was actually in his mind, or he was just writing a good yarn?
I think he was writing a good yarn. I think he also discovered, having written it, what a good story he'd written.
And he performed it a lot, didn't he?
He did. I actually performed it at the New York Public Library, dressed as Dickens, using his copy. Because Dickens had he worked up a performance version of it,
Right.
and which cut out anything he didn't need. And the New York Public Library approached me, and they said, would you come in for Christmas and read from Dickens's prompt copy the version of A Christmas Carol that Dickens performed? And I said, I will only do it if you give me Dickens gear and a beard, because I didn't have one at the time. So somebody stuck one on. And it was so disappointing I grew this one. Mostly in case somebody asks me again. I will have a beard ready. But it was absolutely fascinating for me reading Dickens's version, because this was, I was talking about sort of evolution honing. He'd done it in front of crowds and in front of crowds and in front of crowds, and he knew what worked. And there was stuff, when I read it through beforehand, I was like, you've thrown out some of the most famous lines. They're really the lines you expect to have, and some of them just be taken out. And you've included the scene of playing blind man's buff with the fat cousin. Why would you have that in there? Okay, well, you've got that in. And then I performed it, and it ran beautifully. And just as the tension got to its highest, then we have the scene of blind man playing blind man's buff with the fat cousin, and everybody's laughing. And I'm going, this is brilliant. He really did hone this thing in performance. But he also had hit upon this beautiful structure, which then you could insert almost anything in it, be it Muppets or Blackadder, and it will still work. It's like somebody who built a train. You go, oh my gosh, it's a train. It will work. I've only, I think, stolen it once. But I remember the point where I woke up, and it was one of those moments of actually waking up in the night. It's a long time ago, 26, 27 years ago. I had a phone call from DC Comics, from my editor at DC Comics, saying, Neil, we'd like you to write something. Could you write something that is a guide to all of the magical characters in the DC universe that also has a story and is interesting, but that people could buy as a sort of guide to everything and has a plot? And I said, no, that's stupid. And put down the phone and did that thing where you are almost asleep and you're almost asleep. And then I went, oh, hang on, I could do A Christmas Carol. You just need past, present, future. Only I'd have to do past, present, weird fairylands and places, future. Yeah, I can do that. And I got up and wrote it down because I knew that it would actually vanish if I just let it go to sleep. And I did a book called Books of Magic, which was me just ripping off, and again, it was ripping off that structure. Going, it works. You have a structure. I didn't actually need to reform anybody in that one.
So when you perform, talk about empathy. You study Dickens, you read Dickens, you think about Dickens, you steal from Dickens. And then for one amazing evening, you are Dickens on the stage. What was that like?
It was absolutely fascinating. And it was fascinating for me mostly because one of the things that have fascinated me most about Dickens was why he did these talks, why he did public. Dickens went on the road and went all over America doing an evening with Charles Dickens, where he would read selected passages, where he'd do the whole of this cut-down Christmas Carol and a bunch of other stuff, 3 hours of Dickens. I first became aware of that when I was about 11, when a Welsh actor named Emlyn Williams came to my local theatre doing his version of the evening with Charles Dickens. And I went and loved it and never forgot that Dickens did this thing. And the reason he did it was that at the time copyright was broken. And his books, he was the best-selling author in America, and because copyright didn't quite work between England and America, his books were all pirated, and he didn't make any money. So he went, well, how can I monetize being the best-selling author in America and making no money? And he went, well, people will come and see me. And that absolutely, he went home rich, and with a solid American audience, having actually taken something that should have been a huge problem, the fact that copyright didn't actually provide him with a royalty.
It cost him some of his health.
I was going to say, it cost him significantly in his health.
And yet he had that thing writers seldom have, which is the instant feedback, instead of the 14 months later feedback of the normal book publishing process. And the people are now getting online, and a Twitter writer gets, an exact turnaround time.
It still doesn't, there is still not really feedback. Feedback for me is that moment where I read a short story to an audience and I hear, my favorite moment of audience feedback ever was in 2008. I had this mad idea of, instead of doing a signing tour with the Graveyard book, there were 8 chapters, one of which was twice as long as all of the others. So I would divide that one in half. And I would do 9 stops, and I would read a chapter at each stop. And I thought, that will be, and I'll pre-sign 1,000 books or 2,000 books at each place. Just like I signed the books out there this afternoon. I can sign fast, and I don't mind doing it. And that's a quick process. It's stopping and talking to people, and hugging people and telling them and answering their questions. That's the thing that keeps you there till 3 o'clock in the morning. But the signing is quick. So I'd pre-sign a bunch of books, and I'd do the reading. And I hadn't realized when I thought, okay, I will just stop halfway through chapter 7, that chapter 7 has the biggest, at the exact point that I needed to stop on that page, there was the biggest twist and cliffhanger. And of course, it's not a cliffhanger really if you're reading chapter 7, except that I'm in Los Angeles, and I got to that moment in the story, and the audience went, "Oh!" And I could hear 2,000 people all going at the same time, which was a feeling of power that I have never experienced before. And then I closed the book, and an entire audience went, "Oh." And it's great. We were filming it. You can actually go online and watch. You can watch me doing it, but you can hear the sound effects. That was power. And that was feedback. And that was going, okay, this thing works.
And you left them hanging, and they all went and bought the book to find out how it turned out, I assume. Right?
Well, that's...
I went home. Yeah, the cliffhangers are amazing. And we all know what a cliff is and what hanging off a cliff is. It actually means something. Christopher writes, you write frequently about life, death, and their connection. Have your thoughts about death changed over the course of your work? And you and Terry Pratchett have gone round and round on this, and Terry Pratchett recently died. What's death for you lately?
Death, it's interesting. My thoughts about death and my feelings about death have not really changed. I've always regarded death in some ways as, at least for a writer and emotionally, the line from Peter Pan, death will be an awfully big adventure, has always been huge for me. As I remember the times that I was scared of dying, the time I was most scared of dying, I was 3, maybe 4 issues into Sandman. I think I'd written 4, and the first couple were getting drawn. I'd written the whole of Black Orchid. It's my first graphic novel, which Dave McKean had been painting. Dave was 3/4 of the way through it and had already decided that the artistic style that he had used in Black Orchid was simply wrong, and was not quite sure whether it should be buried, felt it probably shouldn't because he'd done it, but now he needed to move on and do something else. And he gave me all of the art that he'd done so far to take to DC Comics on a plane with him. And because he couldn't afford to get it scanned. So I'm on a plane, couriering. I'm going from England to America on a Pan Am flight. It's Pan Am Flight 5. Going to DC, and I'm carrying with me 3/4 of Black Orchid. And I know that if that plane goes down, Dave is never going to redraw that stuff. He's already itching to get on with Arkham Asylum. I know that the beginning of Sandman isn't really very good, but this thing in my head that I think it can get to is going to be really good. But I'm going to have to at least get through to about issue 8 where Death appears to get that to work. And frankly, if I die at issue 3, DC probably are just going to dump the thing. It's probably easier. So that flight, I was just scared. I did the entire flight mentally trying to hold the plane up. Scared that if I took my attention off it, maybe it would crash.
Responsibility not to interrupt.
It was that, and I was absolutely terrified of dying because I thought if I die right now, there's this really cool and interesting career, and there's this life of stuff that I want to do, and it will never happen, and nobody will quite know that I could have been good. And rather peculiarly, exactly 1 week later to the day, Pan Am Flight 5 exploded. It was
Well, no wonder you remember
there was
the
a
number
Libyan
of the
bomb,
flight.
and I was vaguely relieved that I had not been on it. It was definitely, but it was interesting toward the end of Sandman when I thought, actually, I would think, die, not die. If I die now, nobody will know how Sandman would end. It'll be like Edwin Drood. Would drive them nuts. Probably shouldn't. But mostly my attitude towards death is I've done so much fun stuff.
Interesting.
I've done all of this great stuff.
So all this has to do where you are on the arc. If it's okay to have done a bunch, then death is not such a big deal, but early on. And, soldiers dying in war, almost all young people, interrupted. And
It's like, it's for me, it's all about potential. Terry's death made me a lot of things. Made me very sad, losing my friend. It also made me really angry.
I remember that. And when he was sort of fading into that, what were you angry about?
I was angry about a lot of things. I think one of the things I was angriest about, was one of the things that Terry pointed out when he announced to the world incredibly bravely that he had Alzheimer's. When he was diagnosed, he was 59 years old, 58 years old, diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And he pointed out that for every $200 spent on cancer research, there's something like 3 cents spent on Alzheimer's research. Except the possibility that you are going to get one of these cancers is relatively low. And the probability that you're going to get Alzheimer's is relatively high. But because we regard it as an inevitable, we're not trying to fix it, and we should be.
And didn't he become sort of an advocate for assisted, sort of voluntary dying, assisted dying?
Yeah, he definitely became a serious advocate for having the right, essentially the right to choose your own death, the right to go when you want to, in a situation like that, in a world like that. And he did it angrily, nobly. And then, as it happened, he never, there was the last time I saw him and we talked, he rather proudly confided in me that, he had the stuff. The stuff had arrived mysteriously, and it was kept in a secret place. I'm looking at him going, Terry, you need help to find your way to the bathroom at this point. You are never going to find the secret container with the death pills that you have put inside the combination thing, the secret stuff that you've stashed. You will never find it. You are going to have to say to Rob, your assistant, Rob, can I have the death pills now? And Rob is going to say, no, Terry. But it never came to that.
Well, he must have had some comfort that it was there, even.
Oh, I think it gave him enormous comfort that it was there. I think that was actually what, in a strange way, allowed him to face his death with equanimity. Much as when I gave up smoking, I kept, which was well over 30 years ago now, at least for several years, there was a carton of cigarettes in the freezer. I knew it was there. If I got up in the middle of the night and thought, right, that's it, I'm giving up smoking, it would be there. Oh. And that carton actually was what allowed me to give up smoking. And yet it was there when I needed it, so I didn't need it. And I think the same with Terry's mystery pills that he could never actually have found, but he knew they were there.
Something about options in there, maintaining options. So probably last question. You hauled off and wrote a whole talk for tonight, which thank you. This is not just standing up and doing a reading or your standard Neil Gaiman talk. You really thought through this thing and delivered it. Having thought through this thing about how stories last, was there anything that turned up in the research or in thinking of how to tell about it that surprised you or interested you or sort of made it worth it for you to go through the exercise?
Well, what's interesting for me is we started talking about me giving this talk about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And so I've spent 2.5 years obsessing on...
The long, hard...
It's the long talk for the long now.
It's over now.
But the weird thing is then every time I would find a thing, and I go, I think I'm going to use this in my long now talk, I would then try it out. And so I would tell people things and go and follow, and they would then give me feedback, and I would follow things up. So that actually was lovely because it kept accreting more and more information.
So this was positively Homeric tonight.
It was. Tonight it's like the last time that I get to say some of this stuff because this was what it was for. It was for this talk. I think for me, the thing that I really took away from 2.5 years of thinking about this was an idea that I talk about in the talk, but I don't go as mad as I do occasionally when I'm actually, in a bar explaining this idea, that really you can just view people as this peculiar byproduct that stories use to breed. Really, it's the stories that are the life form. They are older than us, they are smarter than us, they keep going, but they need human beings to reproduce, much as we need food or whatever to reproduce. We need things to keep ourselves alive. And maybe stories really are like viruses. But the idea that functionally they are symbiotic. They give, and they give back. And the reason why people are genuinely, I think, addicted to story. We need it so much more than we think we need it. And the reason why story is so important to us is because it's actually this thing that we have been using since the dawn of humanity to become more than just one person. Whether you want to go to the Australian indigenous people and their stories of the Dreamtime, which are not only stories of the songline stories where you actually get to tell a history that is a legend, that is a myth, that is a map, and that is a map that may go back 20,000 years or 30,000 years. Stories are ways that we communicate important things. But the idea that maybe stories are these things that really are genuinely symbiotic organisms that we live with that allow human beings to advance. It's this mad thing that really did turn up and become very real to me while I was preparing the talk, and which I kind of throttled back because I didn't want any of you to think I'm odd.
Neil, you're odd. Thank you for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.